Good afternoon, and welcome to another one of our cybersecurity seminars. For those of you who are in the room or who are watching this in near real time, this is the first seminar of National Cybersecurity Month. October has been designated as National Cybersecurity Month in the U.S., and there are various kinds of events and recognitions occurring around the country about that. And what we're doing here today is having a talk by someone who has been involved in cybersecurity longer than I have, and there aren't a lot of people who have that distinction, although there are a number of distinguished individuals, including our speaker. Tony Sager has been involved in cybersecurity for about 4 decades, and has been very productive in a number of different pursuits there. He will tell us some about that and provide this very long baseline view of the cybersecurity arena, some of his thoughts on it, and about whether or not it's maturing. He is currently Senior VP and Strategist at the Center for Internet Security, a nonprofit that he'll tell you a little bit about. And please join me in welcoming Tony Sager.
Thank you very much, Spaff, and thank you all for joining me this afternoon. Yeah, as Spaff said, we've been trying to schedule this for at least a couple of years. I retired from the National Security Agency in 2012, and we go back quite a few years, and we had talked about this several times, and we finally been able to pull off the schedule. So I'm glad it worked out, and thank you for joining us. What Spaff said, I woke up one day and I realized I might be one of the longest tenured, longest continuously serving cyber defenders in the entire business, and completely by accident. I wish I could tell you I had some great vision and wisdom as to where the field was going and what would be important someday, and I planned my career accordingly, but of course that's not what happened. I just stumbled into this. So in the mid-70s, I wound up by accident applying for work at the National Security Agency. My real dream was to be an operations research type mathematician at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where my dad had been in the Army. And I remember I wound up in the math faculty area one day, and a recent alumnus had walked in. And it turned out, if you can kind of picture the world of the mid-70s, this person, who I'd never met before, but was a graduate of the same program, was the perfect NSA employee of his day. Advanced degree in math, native Russian speaker. That was like instant job security in the 70s, right? So he was somehow he had wound up at the National Security Agency. So he said, "What are you going to do after you graduate?" I said, "I hadn't really thought about it, but here's what I'm thinking." And he said, "Well, what about NSA? Have you ever considered that?" And I said, "NSA with the rockets and stuff?" And he said, no, NSA. And he wound up, he had a little brochure, which I still have to this day, with a phone number in it. Called the phone number, wound up at College Park, Maryland, taking the hardest math test I've ever taken in my life, and got a call some 10 months later. We'd like to have you join us if you can report in 2 weeks. So that was the nature of bureaucracy back then. So I stumbled into NSA working, and I spent 34 and a half years, all of it working in the defensive mission at NSA. So I'll give you a little bit of history, because as my career evolved, I realized I was kind of stumbling along as part of the evolution of the field that we now call cybersecurity. Right? And again, I wish I could tell you I was really thinking big thoughts and knew what was going to happen, but that's not what happened at all. So, so my career history wound up interwoven with the world that we're in today. And so I'm going to offer some observations, sort of recap some of the big themes that have emerged over time. I've had enough experience, learned a lot of lessons. I often joke that the business of cybersecurity is the failure business, right? We learn more from mistakes. So there's this famous quote from Will Rogers, good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment, i.e. making mistakes. I've been in the room for some of the most amazing mistakes you could ever imagine. And so some of them I made myself, as a matter of fact. But the idea was you learn a lot in this business from failure, right? From seeing how things break, from incidents being reported, right? From breaches and all that kind of stuff. And it's unfortunate that we have to learn so much negatively, but that really seems to be an inherent part of the business here. So if you're old enough in computer security, you have some kind of equation like this running through your head. And they're all slightly different, but it doesn't really matter But let me explain to you mine. Normally I'm talking to math-phobe audiences. I don't think that's going to be the case here. So I normally read them this equation in English. So I'm going to read it to you, but it's not because you don't understand the math. So I often say we're not really in the cyber business or whatever. We're in the risk business, right? Where risk is a function of three primary variables: vulnerability, threat, consequence. And there's a fourth variable, the one we get to manipulate directly, right? Controls is the all-purpose word for defensive things I can do, right? Actions I can take, technology I can buy, training I can deliver. And normally I apply controls so I can change the value of the other three variables, right? So I'd like to drive my vulnerability lower, and I do that by some technology, some training, the way I develop software, et cetera. I'd like to know more about threat so I can make good decisions, right? So I can spend money to learn about threat. I can subscribe to threat feeds. I can get reporting. I can deploy my own people. I can buy sensors. All those kinds of things allow me to learn more about threat. And then consequences is really a function of the business model, the agency's mission, or whatever the real desired outcome of the business is, right? And I can do things to help me manage consequence. Like the big buzz over lost laptops in taxis. That's a big thing in the areas that I work. And of course, you can encrypt the data, right? So it's at rest on these laptops. Well, that's a technical control, but why are you doing it? Well, you're doing it really to manage the consequence, right? So if the laptop gets lost, it's a lost piece of technology, but the data is inaccessible. So the consequence to the business is well managed in a case like that if you do it well. Anyway, so there's these variables are always kind of running in your head. So my career can actually be summarized in this equation. Right? I was hired to be a vulnerability analyst. So on behalf of the defense, hired to pretend to attack US systems, US cryptography initially, so that we would understand what was wrong, right? So we could understand our vulnerability and do something about it. Now those are, historically, the times seem pretty quaint compared to today. Back then, 10 to 15 years to build a new radio for the US Army, right? Long development programs, gigantic budgets relatively speaking. The other thing that we had back then, and believe me, we were working really hard. Again, it doesn't seem like it by today's standards, but we had the luxury of lots of time, right? Long development times. We had a relatively large amount of money to invest to improve security. But most importantly, we had control of the environment. Okay? We could decide who participated. You either have a security clearance or you don't. You're a trusted company to the US government or you're not, right? It was a kind of a binary decision. You were in, you were out. And think of that as control of the environment. And in today's world, of course, you have essentially none of those, right? You don't have much time to make security decisions. You don't have an infinite budget. And you certainly don't have control of the environment. So we go from a world where the government sort of runs this activity, is in control of it, to one where it doesn't. And I'll talk a little bit about what all that means. So another way to look at my career, I tried to diagram all the jobs I had and organizations I was a part of or I managed during my time. So look at the lower left. I was hired as a ComSec analyst, communications security, right? So looking at the cryptography primarily of US systems, US randomization, key management, and things like that. And playing the role of bad guy. All right, now why would you do that? Remember the prior equation, right? Function of vulnerability and threat. So remember, in those days, historically, at a national level, we thought of having one enemy, right? It wasn't this sort of wide open world. There was sort of one nation that was a threat to our existence. And how much did we know about this threat to our existence? How much threat intelligence did we have? Well, even as a person who had lots of security clearances, I can tell you we didn't really know very much, right? There was no marketplace of threat feeds. There wasn't this wide open reporting of attackers and their successes and their failures. So we believed we were vulnerable, right? We believed there was an existential threat. So what do you do if you're a risk decision maker and you're faced with this really heavy threat and you don't understand it? Well, you, by nature, right, a rational person then says, I'm going to think about all the bad things that could happen. I'm going to plan for the worst, design for the worst, and build for the worst. Okay? And one way I do that is I hire a bunch of geeky people to be in the back room to pretend to be the bad guy, right? We call that penetration testing, red teaming, black hatting, vulnerability analysis. So that was really the role that folks like me played, right? We were there to help understand the threat so that we could make good design decisions. Now again, you do that because you have the luxury of lots of time, money, and control of the environment, right? none of which we have in any great supply today. So lower left, ComSec, and then all these other threads, and SPAF has a role coming into computer security and all these different things. So there were many organizations, threads, and you can see, okay, so communication security was aimed at what? What question primarily in security? Confidentiality, right? And if you can narrow your security concern to confidentiality, you're actually in pretty good shape, at least by today's standards, right? Because what do you do with confidentiality? You equate the difficulty of protecting communications with a really hard, well known to be hard mathematical problem, right? That's why mathematics was the primary discipline of those days. So you say, if I can equate the difficulty of reading my mail to a known hard mathematical problem, what do I get for free? Centuries of research in mathematics, right? Like factoring and problems like that. So that's why you do that. And that's why at the heart of it, cryptography is really a mathematician's game. And so that was the way we thought of the security problem to be solved. Therefore, the primary career field was around ComSec, mathematical cryptanalysis, and so forth. But of course, again, those days are kind of quaint by today's complex standards, right? So we have to worry about as information becomes more fluid, it moves more, it's in more places, lots more people have to see it. You have to worry about the technology that handles it, moves it, et cetera, right? So computer security, and then you have to worry about as information takes more form, the security of the information itself becomes the driver, not the cryptography, not the computing device. So you have information security, system security, all these things start to become the way you have to think about this problem. The all-purpose term that emerged quite some time ago, still the name of the mission at NSA, is information assurance. And that was actually kind of a breakthrough in security, right? There was a bit of nuance there, not everyone understood it, but information assurance was meant to imply there is no golden state known as security, right? There's no done, there's no end state here. Assurance is about confidence, right? Measuring confidence or making an assessment of confidence, which changes constantly because you get constant new information, right? So your world gets more complex, you learn more about bad guys, the business makes more demands upon information technology. So you have this complex changing environment. And so assurance was meant to imply this sort of never-ending struggle to both learn what I should worry about and then take action upon it. So that's still historically around. Eventually, and you can see as these names go on, right, they are broader in scope, bigger in their thinking about the problem, and hence sort of more generic or more general. And then today, and there's all these different pieces down there. It turns out almost all these correspond to organizations I was a part of. For 80% of them, I never actually changed desks, right? It wasn't me following the evolving cyber mission. It was the organization, the institution, evolving to deal with a growing awareness of the problem, and hence, what should we do about it? So we rethink ourselves, revamp our missions, rename ourselves, and grows and grows. Until you come to the all-purpose word cyber. And I don't know what your culture is here, but anyone who says cyber with nothing after it probably doesn't know what they're talking about, right? There are more cyber warriors walking around the DoD right now who couldn't spell IT if you spotted them the eye. I mean, it's because it's trendy, right? It's the hot thing. You can get more money and authority and power. So that's the nature of bureaucracy. So another parallel reason for these renamings is because I call it the salute the flyer, a taller flag theory of organizational design. Whatever it is you're working on, Gene, that's really nice. But I'm working on something grander, and the flag is taller, and we salute even more. So I'm going to rename myself to have a grander name than yours. And so it's a bit of a chase for authority and so forth. And I'm not a cynical bureaucrat, but that's been the way I've observed it over these years. So complex, lots of changes, but think of it as as our understanding of the problem grows, right? As the complexity of the problem itself grows through all this, this world of, I never thought I said, how did I miss the meeting where we thought it would be a good idea to share our network with the bad guys, right? When you're old enough, you think, well, if it was sensitive, we had our own networks, right? Our own leased lines, parallel communications paths. We controlled the environment, right? And then this internet thing hit us. And, it's a great thing that it did. But the complexity of the security problem just exploded, right? We have our economy, our national treasure, our personal wealth. Everything about our health is essentially floating around in the public. And so, again, it wasn't a conscious choice to operate like this, but that's the natural evolution of this. So if I could, I call these the seismic shifts. So it's kind of big movements in the business. So most of them I've talked to you about already. This focus, the singular focus on confidentiality, cryptography, right? What we called communication security or ComSec back then, much more broadly now focused. And if you think of cyber as the all-purpose word, then it encompasses all of that, right? From confidentiality, but also the integrity of information, the availability, the economic issues underlying it. The primary discipline goes from mathematics, right? Hey, mathematics is, when you're a mathematician, math is the center of the universe. That's taught to you in your introductory classes. But there are all these other fields that have dramatic impact on security, right? From computer science, engineering, networking, operations. So I shifted my career early. I mentioned, as a mathematician, working on cryptography of US systems. My life was changed forever around 1980 or so with the personal computer revolution. And I switched my career field from math to computer science for one reason. I figured out the government would buy me an Apple II Plus to have on my desk if I switched my career field. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever, right? Because I grew up with mainframes. Punch cards, anyone old enough, right? Punch cards. You have to be really nice to the guy behind the counter so you can get more than one run done during a day. Oh my gosh, that's like Stone Age. I thought that was the most tedious, unpleasant way to spend my analytic time. So this idea of having computing power on your desk, under your control, that one human being could understand, it was really extraordinary to me. So why would the government buy a nice young person like me an Apple II Plus? It was because they wanted to support my hobbies and my personal interests? Not at all. Because we were moving to a world where this commodity computing, right, driven by what we used to call before that the microprocessor revolution, was changing everything. See, I started, in the organizations I started in, don't laugh, software was considered too unreliable, too flaky to do anything important in security. All cryptography was built in custom hardware. All nuclear weapons control systems were in custom hardware, right? Because we could control it. We could design it, we could test it, we could model it. We could model what happened, conceptually, at every gate and transistor and pretend it failed and see if that had an outcome we didn't like. If so, I'm going to put an alarm on there, or I'm going to duplicate it, right? Or I'm going to put some extra circuitry. Hardware was reliable. Hardware could be trusted. Software, way too flaky, right? But economics always wins. So these little microprocessors and personal computers started to sneak in as the front panel display for the hardware cryptography, the interface box, the communications controller, right? The panel, the display panels. It was inevitable, very inexpensive, very cheap, very easy to reuse, integrated circuitry allowed us to have these kinds of functions at incredible costs, right? Incredibly low costs. At the cost of, though, loss of control, right? You're buying things really off the marketplace. So a lot of designs came in about that time to take advantage of this commodity hardware, but then to try to duplicate, triplicate, work around, build alarms, all kinds of workarounds to try to actually make this useful. So you move from math, you move to all these other disciplines. When I switched, though, from math to computer science, people at NSA thought I just committed career suicide, right? Because the computer science people at that time, I've heard this many times, that's just the implementation of security. Right? Math is where the action is. And then that software that, that actually controls whether the cryptography works or not, that's mere implementation details. Okay, I didn't mind because I was having so much fun. I thought it was so interesting. So we then shift, another big shift, this focus from the technology itself, right? The math, how good is the hardware, to how does it get used? Because we all know this is one of the lessons of modern life, right? No matter how good your security, no matter how good your product, users are incredibly creative at undoing security, right? That's just our nature. And so operations have started to dominate the cyber business, right? The attackers, the game, us versus them, incident management or incident response, all these things have taken over. And you move to this sort of quasi-war fighting, heroic battling back and forth. And so these other disciplines start to really come in as important in this. And we move from, well, we got the technology right, and too bad they couldn't use it well, right? To people in the security business are active participants, right? We are in the fight. So we cover the range now from the ideas, the research, the basic technology, the mathematics, up to and including the operational use of things. There's a talk I used to give, and the title is I'm a Reformed Monopolist. Okay, that world of the 70s I told you about, right? That was a government monopoly. That's not a bad thing. That's just where we were. If you cared about security, you were somehow associated with the US government because we treated it, rightfully, like a national security problem. We don't all build our own armies here in town, right? We pay our taxes. The national government protects us against enemies out there, beyond our borders, right? In physical space. We don't even think differently about it. And that's kind of the nature of the way we thought of this game in the 70s and 80s. There were enemies and their friends. And we could decide who they were. We knew who they were. But now the world is much more complicated, right? So we move from the government will tell you when technology is safe enough. That was one of the jobs I played, right? Test something to make sure it's acceptable, to an open market. So we go from 10 years to develop a radio and the government will tell you when it's good enough to, my gosh, where's my new iPhone? They haven't come out with anything in a year. And whatever it is, I need it now. I didn't know I needed it a month ago, but I need it now. And that puts a lot of pressure on the security business, right? There's no 10 years to make a security decision. There's no room full of analysts, at least in the government sense, that gets to study this commercial technology before it comes out, right? So it puts tons of pressure on our ability to make good security decisions. And then the last one is really the driver, and I want to leave you with this in this sort of seismic shifts. I talked about the way we thought of cyber as a national security problem, right? And it is, but that was the entire focus of the 70s or so. But today, what's driving the business, I'll give you some examples in a bit, it's really about economic and social risk. Right? That's what's really driving us today. And I do a lot of public speaking. The most frequent requests I'm getting for the last year or so are not from technologists, not from security people. I don't know if you're tired of hearing from me or not, but you know who asks to understand about this problem? Insurance companies, auditors, law firms. There's not a law firm, certainly in the DC area, that doesn't have a cybersecurity institute now with a certification, right? Every insurance company is in this business. Every auditing firm has some sort of a cyber auditing, division associated with them. They're all coming. Now, as technologists, that makes us uncomfortable. Oh my gosh, the lawyers will ruin this. Well, but this is the way as social creatures, we organize ourselves, right? This is what happens. It's not about technology, it's about how human beings, citizens, institutions make decisions, which are driven by things like economics and social ideas, right? Perceptions of risk. So there's a term I'm using, I'll try it on, please don't take it personally. We might have hit peak geek here in cybersecurity, right? This idea of this is driven by geeks and, hey, don't be worried, there's plenty of great work out there for all of us. That's not the issue. But when we think of it as a wizard and geek-driven business, then we take one perspective in terms of its impact on society. But rightfully, in terms of how decisions get made at grand scale and the role of citizens and companies, it's really driven by the last line up here. So think about that a bit, and I think there'll be some other examples. Here's sort of a lessons learned now. Those were the big themes from my perspective, but lessons learned. So anyone remember the movie Independence Day? Not the recent remake, no, the real Independence Day movie, right? So I often say cybersecurity is not like Independence Day. What do I mean? Independence Day, the movie, the aliens are coming, right? Big mother ship and all that kind of stuff. We know who the enemy is. They're there. Right? Heroic, brilliant people on our side take the alien technology, turn it around against them, come up with a clever virus. They heroically fly up to the mothership, deliver the virus. Boom. Battle is done. We all get to cheer. It's over. We win. That's not cybersecurity. If you work in cybersecurity as a practitioner, it's much more like the movie Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over again. And you can get it right 50 days in a row. Guess how many parades there are for cybersecurity practitioners and defenders? Not that many, right, Steph? Not many parades for us who are slogging through. It's a great day when nothing happens. And very few people are wise enough to thank you for it. But you certainly get their attention when something bad happens, right? CISOs are hired to be fired. And so there's, it can be a thankless business. And yet it's incredibly satisfying. I mean, I chose to spend my 35 years doing this stuff because I think the challenge of defense is so much more interesting and satisfying. And my friends who work offense, hey, all you got to do is find one thing and exploit it. Big deal, right? Well, they're a lot better than that, but it's still, their challenges are really different. But at least they get victory every once in a while, right? At least they get to take care of a bad guy, steal the information, inform the US government, whatever it happens to be. They get more victories, they get more parades. Get used to it. That's the nature of the business, right? It's okay. Defense is amazing in its own right. Another lesson for me, so I mentioned that equation, right? My life was in vulnerability. So one of the reasons I spend time putting these ideas together and talking to people, by nature of the work that I've done, I think I've seen as many things break as maybe anybody in the business. So I spent the first third of my life, professional life, learning the craft of finding vulnerabilities, right? Initially in mathematics, right? And NSA is an amazing institution with an in-house body of knowledge and a great system to bring people up in that technical discipline. Switched to computer security. Spent a lot of my technical time as what was called a software vulnerability analyst. Think of it as finding 0 days, and I called it reading other people's software for a living. And then scaling that up to look at systems, networks, and up to operational testing. So red teams, NSA Red Team was one of my groups, blue team. And when nations fight against nations, right, this is not a packet-to-packet fight. This is think of it as a full-dimensional fight. Everything from the software to the hardware to the bugs in the walls and implants and signal theory and signal stealing and all cameras and hidden in little all that stuff you see in the movies. It's not quite that good, but it's pretty close. Okay, so that's how nations compete. So at the peak job I had, there were about 750 people whose sole purpose was to find flaws. So I got to see a lot of these, both directly as created by my groups, but also in my work with the rest of the Defense Department, the intelligence community, huge hunks of the industry I've worked a lot with on these. So got to observe over and over again problems, right? Try to understand root cause, see what red teams find, see problems found in the sort of core mathematics, in the way a product is built, in the way it gets applied, its emergent security properties in a system context, and then in real life how bad things can be made to happen. And it was startling, right? So I worked as a technical person primarily, worked as a manager for a third, and then spent the last third of my career both as a manager but also looking at all this and going, what in the world is going on here? Why are we seeing the same things over and over again? That's what kept striking me. So, and we did good things, right? The red team, we found a problem, we told them, we gave them PowerPoint, we told them exactly what we exploited, we gave them the Microsoft patch number to fix it. Those problems almost never got fixed. And you could draw a quick conclusion, right? And some military senior people I dealt with did. Oh, our defenders are lazy, they don't care, they're untrained, blah, blah, blah. And my response was, any enterprise of any size, like the Defense Department, that puts their fate into the hands of 20-year-old tech school graduates is guilty of bad strategy, right? So, I've been in meetings where the general wants to fire the private who failed to put in the patch that was exploited, blah, blah, blah. I said, that's the same, by the way, General, that's the same private that, suppose he'd ask you for 2 hours of downtime so he could update the mail server. Oh, can't do that, that's mission essential, we must have the mail. So we're taking our lowest paid, youngest, least loved, right, most under-equipped part of the workforce, giving them conflicting requirements and expecting them to save us, running incredibly complex, incredibly fragile technology that was never designed for the kind of things that we put it through. That's bad strategy. And it's not the way to really think about this problem. So knowing about the flaws themselves is not enough to get them fixed, right? And yet most of our business is geared to this sort of breathless drama of revealing the red team result, of exposing the 0 day, right, of this sort of publicity generating, heroic cleverness to find flaws. And yet history tells us that doesn't get them fixed by itself. And why is that? Well, it's because that's not why people make those decisions, right? Sometimes you can embarrass people into fixing things. But if you want to get to the real root cause, then you have to think more strategically about these problems. So people would say, hey, the red team told them what to do. They're good people. They even told them the Microsoft patch number to put in place to stop them, right? But anyone who's thought about this, and I know you all have, fixing that patch, what happens the next time the red team comes? They just come somewhere else. Or someone undoes that patch because they couldn't install some application, right? So the notion was the thing that got exploited doesn't get fixed at its root, right, fundamentally, except at a different place in a different point in the life cycle. That is, if you can't manage configuration changes at scale across a complex enterprise, then it doesn't matter if you fix the one patch, the one hole, the one configuration change, because it'll get undone or lost in the noise of all these other changes. And yet, and here's a fact, of all the red teamers that worked for us in NSA, that group was 150 people, by the way, right? Not a one of them that I ever met had ever run a network bigger than would fit in a couple of desks, right? That's not why we hired them. That's not why we trained them. They didn't speak the language of system administration. So they didn't know how to convey what they learned, right? What they pointed out, what they discovered. They didn't know how to translate it into the language of better system administration. It's not their fault. And yet we treated that information so closely that people that did understand it weren't authorized to hear the story. You know, the blue team worked for me, right? And the red team would find these problems. The blue team would be tasked to go fix them, working for me. But they weren't authorized to hear what the red team had found. Does that sound ridiculous? Yeah, it does, right? It was true. And I said, one day they're both going to work for me, and I'm going to fix that problem. I'm going to put the same manager in charge of them, and I'm going to hold them accountable to see that problems get fixed. Because pointing them out is just part of the life cycle, right? So at the end of the day, we need to fix things. But that was one of the great lessons for me, that information, cyber defense is really an information management game. It's not a technology game. It's not about buying the best box. It's about moving information from where it's created to where it's needed and in a form in which it's needed. So that example I gave you of the red team finds it, right? It creates information. It finds an exploitation. The challenge was to move it to the place where it's needed, i.e. the system administrators, in a form and a language in which it's needed. The language of configuration control and management across a complex distributed enterprise. And what I did a quick study. 50% of what the red teams would find could not be fixed by the system owner that asked them to come in. 50%. Why? Well, because they would say, well, we walked right through your perimeter, Mr. System Owner, and they go, thank you, you guys are really clever. It was wide open. Why? Because we would work on this DoD network, but the premise routers, the big routers at the edge, were not actually run by them, it was run by DISA, right? So it's the equivalent of their internet service provider. And guess what DISA's criteria was? I want to cut the number of human beings I have to pay. So the routers are all wide open, okay? That's very cheap to run. It's not very good security though. So you can tell DISA, or you can tell the system owner, this is your problem, but they can't do anything about it. In fact, if they're really clever, and most of them were, they had already told DISA, please don't run my premise routers wide open, right? You're leaving me exposed. Right, so you couldn't fix it. A number of problems that they found were really a function of DoD policy. They had to do it that way because that was the policy. So if you didn't tell the policy maker they had made a mistake, right, you couldn't tell the system owner, you had to tell somebody else. And then a quarter of the problems were only fixable really by the vendor. If you didn't tell the vendor, you could never solve that problem at the root cause level. So this information management then is really the nature of successful cyber defense, not technology. And it's not about information sharing, right? The only thing that legislators can agree upon in Washington today is threat sharing, right? We're going to pass legislation to encourage threat sharing and protect people from threat sharing. You know why they agree to that? Because it's viewed as harmless, right? It's like motherhood and apple pie. Threat sharing is good, therefore we should share more threats. You know, when I talk to public audiences, 99.9% of what you need to know to defend yourself, you already have in the public. You don't need any other threat feeds, frankly. You don't need any double top secret information from the US government. Believe me, I live in that stuff. It's in the public already, right? The challenge is not getting more stuff into your inbox. The verb to remember is translate. How do you translate millions of data points into a small number of positive, constructive things you can do? That's the real fundamental challenge of cybersecurity, right? It's an information management problem, a translation problem. So whenever people say threat sharing, I always say, no, translation is the problem, not the sharing itself. Yeah, sharing is good. We all salute. It's lovely. We want to share. We want to learn. But for the vast majority of consumers, adopters, enterprises, translation is the problem. And here's an observation. Most federal agencies can't do that. Most enterprises can't do that. Take smart people, all right, access to information, a lot of skill, a lot of time, translation into action. So we'll talk about what we're doing about that. Next thing to remember is the bad guy doesn't perform magic, right? There's still a sort of a romance to this business. you know, this is about wizards, and the scruffiest looking person in the room, I won't name any names here, must be the smartest person, so we have to hire them. And if you treat this as wizardry, what's your only defense? Hire your own wizards, right? You have no choice. Bad guys are good at what they do, believe me. And I'm one of the few defenders that lived in an offense organization for 35 years, right? So a defender who gets to live and breathe and cross-train people and move them back and forth across the biggest attack machine, you know, really in the world. And so you learn a lot from that. You learn that they are good, but they don't do magic. They have a boss, they have a budget, right? They don't like to take risks. They like to be pretty certain that what they do is going to work. So they can be very cautious. So let me offer you a little free content here. If you ever next time you go to YouTube, look for these search terms. A guy named is Rob Joyce, R-O-B-J-O-Y-C-E, with this acronym TAO. Okay, Tailored Access Operations. Rob Joyce, TAO. There's a 40-minute video on there. It was at the Rob delivered this. Rob's a friend of mine, still at NSA. It's a 40-minute video given at the Enigma conference, I think, a year or so ago. It's the most underappreciated video in the business right now, I think. Rob is the director of Tailored Access Operations. Think of them, I offer no official verification of anything, as the organization outed by Edward Snowden. This is the attack machine of the US government, right, at NSA. And basically, the theme of his talk is how to stop his teams. And you will not hear magic. You won't hear, you know, he didn't hold much back, frankly. What you will hear is professionalism, patience, willingness to build infrastructure, willingness to wait for a person on the network to make a mistake, willingness to look for your weak points or your weak connections, right? No magic. Skill, professionalism, patience, yes. No magic. If you could do what he recommends that you do, you're protected against the vast majority of attacks today, without question, okay? And the things that Rob are telling you, they're exactly what my nonprofit is telling you. And I'll show you in a minute. It's exactly the positive unclassified guidance coming out of NSA. It's exactly the positive guidance coming out of the Australian ASD and lots of other places, right? There's no mystery to that. And by the way, we all talk. We all talk to each other. We're all friends, swapping notes, thinking about how to solve this problem. So we don't do magic from the bad guy side. We don't have to do it from the good guy side. And then the last of the Pareto principle, 80-20 rule, it really does apply in this space. That is, you can get most of your value from a relatively small number of things. Not to solve the problem, but to make most of your progress. So the rule is basically 80% of your value comes from 20% of your inputs or your variables or whatever. And so the key is, though, can you figure out what that 20% is? That's what you need to think about. So the term I use for this, so here's the irony of the business. Right? I started in those monopoly days, no marketplace, monopoly provider from the US government. At this moment, we have more tools, training, right, technology, things to help us as defenders than we've ever had in our history. And yet, we seem to be getting worse, not better. Actually, technically, we're getting better, but not nearly as fast as bad guys are getting better. So what's going on here? So we go from this monopoly situation that we talked about, and I was trying to come up with some way to convey the complexity, and the term I came up with was the fog of more. Okay? What paralyzes people today or confuses them or misdirects them is too many choices, right? Too many advice givers, too many magical marketing claims from vendors, too many conflicting overseers, regulators, you know, people that want to know what you're doing, expect you to prove that you've done the right thing in security. It's overwhelming to figure out what to do. That's what's paralyzing people today, right? It's a confusing time. You don't know who to trust. There's too many options, too many vendors, too many claims. There's no way to sort this out on your own for the vast majority of enterprises. So it's the difference here, and the fog of more is actually a pun on the book, The Fog of War, if any of you remember that. We were all required to read that at one point in my NSA career. And it was talking about the impact on high-risk decision-making, specifically warfighting, right, at the emergence of the information age. So you're making decisions with amazingly dire consequences, life and death consequences, and you're doing it with rapidly changing information of uncertain quality and confidence, but you still have to make a decision. right? So how do you manage that really complex environment? So the term the author came up with was the fog of war, and I used more as a way to capture this. This is the topic of my RSA talk in 2014. But for a lot of people, it helps capture for them why they are confused, right? They just don't quite get this. So how do we get through all this? Well, I call this the defender's dilemma, the three-part challenge in front of you. You have to figure out the right thing to do, right? I talked about that. And how much to do, because you don't have infinite resources. Everything in cybersecurity defense is about prioritization. It doesn't matter how much money you have or how little. It's all about prioritization of your actions, of your funding. And then you have to actually do it. And by that I mean convince the boss, get a budget, pick the right tool out of the marketplace, implement it, operationalize it, do all that. But the most insidious, most challenging of all is number 3. You have to prove to others that you've done the right thing. And you're going to have to do this over and over and over again. I mentioned auditors, insurance companies, right, regulators, folks like that. They think of them as enforcers, right? Their job is to verify or validate what you have done. But this is more pervasive than that. We are all, every institution is now part of a complex supply chain, right? From a Walmart to an automotive manufacturer. They have thousands of supply chain partners integrated into their supply chain, their development cycle, their production line, etc. To make that work, you have to have IT that integrates all this together. i.e., you have to share data and control paths, right, in a really complex way. Oh, and by the way, if you're a supplier to Walmart, for example, and the notion is you have access to certain data because no one wants to store stuff in a warehouse. Too expensive, wasteful. So therefore, the agreement is on the Walmart stores, when the inventory gets below a certain level, just ship it directly from the manufacturer. We're not sticking it in a warehouse and moving it. We want it to come directly from the manufacturer. So the contract is so that you know on your own when the inventory gets too low. That triggers a message, right? Which triggers then action to bring information. Highly efficient, very cost effective. But now you're sharing IT, at least at some level. So you have to have some measure of trust, right? I have to develop trust. Around that purpose, I have to identify what data is needed, what control paths, and then how do I make that work in a way that doesn't undo my business model, right? Think of some of the big hacks that have happened, like Target, right? You're bringing suppliers who you don't know much about their security or the way they protect information or the way they deal with their credentials into your environment. So a subcontractor might need access to certain parts of your environment. Does that mean they need access to your point of sale terminals? Not likely. Or to your backroom accounting? Not likely, right? So you have to, as an IT person, figure out how to make this work and then protect against it. So that how do I demonstrate to others I've done the right thing? So this is going to happen over and over and over again at every scale. So this is what really drives the business now in the future. And I call this trust has gone from a binary condition. Remember where I grew up, right? Cleared or not, trusted by the US government or you're not, you're my ally or you're not, to this world where trust is dynamically renegotiated over and over again around very specific purposes, okay, in a business context. I actually came up with this in war fighting. I call it Tony's 3 rules of war, as you'll forgive me. Then you'll immediately know why I should never have been in uniform. Tony's 3 rules of war. Number 1, we never go to war without our friends. Okay? That's U.S. doctrine, right? Think of coalition war fighting in the Middle East and that kind of stuff. We never go to war without our friends. Number 2, we don't know who our friends are until the day before we go to war. Right? If you ever watch those politically, a politics watcher, this is not the happy kumbaya coalition of the willing moving forward, right? There's a mix of arm twisting and bribery and cajoling and convincing to get all this to come together at the last minute often. And that was literally happened in some of the conflicts in the Middle East. So you never know who or you don't go to war without your friends. You don't know who they are till the day before. And the third is, half your friends can't stand each other. And they certainly don't trust you. Okay? So these are complex coalitions brought together to do some of the most dangerous work on earth, right? Fight wars, which means and think of the IT challenge now. How do you do that successfully? Well, if all these nations can't tell who the good guys are from the bad guys, you got problems, okay? Because you're bombing the wrong people. And so you're trying to combine these forces in a logical way to achieve an objective and yet keep everybody safe. That's the warfighting equivalent of the business challenge, right? So we trust each other, but only for that purpose, only for a given amount of time, only for the data and control that we have agreed upon in order for us to execute that purpose. That's the nature of this business now, is how do we establish that kind of environment where that can be done quickly, efficiently, cheaply. So I'm working with a number of vendors like Walmart and others who are trying to figure out how do I assess the security of several thousand suppliers, right? As cheaply and as quickly as possible. And if one of them can't meet my cost, I kick them out and I bring the next one in. And so I can do the same for them. Very dynamic and very challenging. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a couple of things so you'll, but I will say this. You can't survive as long as I have in this business without being one of two personality types. Complete cynic, hopeless optimist, right? And the cynic has something to pick on every day in this business, right? Some bad thing had happened. It's great. If you like being, I know people at NSA who've made their entire careers around being cynical. You've met many of them, Staff. Nothing, no names. And that's good. We need people who, sort of truth tellers and, coyote people, if you know that lore and all that kind of stuff. But if we're going to make real progress, we need lots of hopeless optimists too. Belief that we can change things. So things are changing. I mentioned most of these already, right? I mean, a number of us grew up in the days where we had to actually, only we care about security. How come no one else cares about it? Well, now everybody cares about it, right? It's popular magazine fodder. It's headlines. So you can't help but at least be aware at some level. Institutions are motivated. I remember, I mentioned to you the who wants to hear from me now? It's all these really social institutions. All these things are starting to go into motion. Resources, there's talent, there's great centers like this. I mean, this is one of the pioneering educational centers. And there is better technology. I don't want to tell you there's a rosy future ahead, but there is. There's some reasons for optimism here. So here's what I'm doing about it, and then I'll finish up here. So all these observations over all this time, I've retired 4 years ago. On a lark, frankly, one afternoon, the most frequent question I was getting in the mid-2000s was, what do I do first? Okay, that's one of the fog questions. There's 1,000 things out there. There's security guidance, and by the way, NSA started releasing security guidance to the public in 2001, and I was the manager who led that campaign, right? I didn't do it because we're just nice people, that we are nice people at NSA. We did it because we recognized we're all in this together, right? There's no boundary for the DoD anymore. No one gets moved or paid or uniformed without commercial friends. So we have to help everyone get better. But in 2008, the question was, what do I do first? Then I would say, oh, there's the NSA security guidance and the NIST has some good stuff and you can go over here. No, got it. That's thousands and thousands of pages and all this technical gobbledygook. What do I do first? What do I convince my boss of first? Where's my first dollar best spent? What do we focus on for the first quarter? And I just said, gosh, I never thought of it that starkly before. But that's reality for a lot of decision makers, right? Or a lot of security professionals trying to convince decision makers. You can't sell them on a 10-year program without some results. You've got to bring focus, and you can only keep so much of the boss's attention. So what do I do first? So I gathered 5 friends in a room, and these are not ordinary friends. These are extraordinary friends. Representing the full range of knowledge at an NSA. And I said, no one leaves the room till we agree on a small number of things all of our friends should do. Not to solve world hunger, not to create peace in our time. Because if you get enough security pros in the room, what happens? You will get an infinite to-do list, right? An infinite list of problems and an infinite list of things to do. That's not very helpful. That's the fog problem. I said, so small means 5 to 7. All of our friends should do these, not to solve the problem, but to get started, to sort of lay the foundation for the rest of. And this business, nothing personal, guys, draws really bright, really opinionated people. You don't have to look at anybody in this room. They wouldn't leave the room until we agreed to 10. I couldn't bring them to 5 to 7. So a list of 10 on two pieces of paper went down to the Pentagon and a few friends. That was it. If you don't know where to begin, start here. Just an afternoon lark. Never dreamed of it any bigger. Got a call several months later from the SANS Institute. Hey, we have your list. It's pretty good. We'd like to build a project around it. So they take it from 5 friends to 5,000 friends on a mailing list, right? Most of whom don't know each other. And they partner up with a nonprofit called a think tank called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And they create something originally named as the Consensus Audit Guidelines, better known as the SANS Top 20. And the idea was this list of 20 most important things you could do based upon what bad guys are doing, right? Not speculative, but based upon specific knowledge, what bad guys are doing today, how should I prioritize my actions? What are the most important set of things to do? 2012, I wind up retiring from NSA, go to the SANS Institute to run some special projects, eventually took this back over, spun it out into a nonprofit company with some sponsorship from SANS and some of the other companies in the business. And it lives today in the Center for Internet Security. So I've chosen to spend the second act of my career focused on this, what I would call operational practice. You might think of it as, what's the best we can do with what we've got available to us today? Right? I'm glad that, Spaff shared some of the research summaries here. There are people that need to solve some of these foundational harder problems, absolutely. But I chose to focus on what can we do with what we have available to us today, right? What's on the shelf in the marketplace we know about, because I think that's the 80-20 part of this, the stuff where we can get a lot of return for a relatively modest amount of work. And I'm not saying it's trivial, right? It doesn't make it easy. But for example, the official number from the US CERT, right, the US Computer Emergency Response Team, is 85% of the incidents that they manage, right, scarce high-priced labor for the US government, 85% of what they manage, both by numbers and by time, come down to basically hygiene problems. Failure to patch, bad configurations, terrible lack of zero network segmentation, and no separation of anything. Pretty normal, basic, good IT operational stuff. That's their number. Everybody else who's ever studied this, from the Gartner Group, Symantec, et cetera, comes up with a number between 80 and 93% of the problems that they track, that they manage, that they say, come down to basically washing your hands, getting your shots, right? Not coughing on your neighbor kind of stuff. Pretty straightforward things. So that's something where we can make a lot of progress. That's where I've been spending my time. I'll give you a reference as to how to find these things. This is not a commercial. You can tell I spent my life in government, right? This is all done with volunteer labor. I'm the chief cat herder, organizer, community activist for this. And then, much to the surprise of many of my business friends, we give it away for free. So, because it's created really through community labor. Right, that's the way I like to think of this. We monetize it through some membership models and other things, and other services and so forth. But when you're operating in this model, we're not trying to build a big company, right? We're trying to build a big community to pull all these things together. One of the other lessons for me is that if you want a good list of things to do, you can go walk on any street corner in cybersecurity, right? You can find lots of magazine articles and go to NIST. Again, remember the knowing about a flaw doesn't get it fixed. Having a good list of things to do doesn't make them happen, right? There are great lists out there. There's great information. What's been missing, I think, is community building, is identification of barriers we have in common, a nonprofit to go negotiate with the vendors, right, to help them align their products along with the most important things to do. So we're putting all that together now from the Center for Internet Security. And here's some of the things I'll mention briefly. This has taken on a life of its own in the last 3 years. So the big recent event for us was the California Attorney General Data Breach Report. Came out end of last winter. Basically summarized and categorized all the data breaches in California since 2012. And recommendation number 1 was, if you want to deal with this problem, use the Center for Net Security Critical Controls. Much to my surprise, I never met these people before they recommended it. That caused more phone calls to come into me, asking me to explain it, and me sheepishly saying, I have no idea. I think I better go introduce myself to the Attorney General of California. So last week I spent in California giving workshops. The concern of the Attorney General, and it's a legit one in California, is how can we help really small up to medium businesses deal with this problem? Because they can't deal with it. They don't have budgets for this. They don't have security staff for this. There's no way they're going to do it on their own. So we're retuning a lot of our content really to aim for these small businesses, right? We write them in plain English, lots of pointers to free software, lots of sort of community building to band people together that are similarly situated so that they can learn from each other, create use cases, that kind of stuff. So that's the stuff that we're doing. We're in the NIST cybersecurity framework. If you look at the tail end or the recommendations, and one of the things I spend a lot of my time doing is talking to the big threat intelligence companies. What are you guys seeing, right? I don't get all their data. I get summaries of their data. And we map them into our control set to make sure that we're picking a good set. So you can look in the recommendation section of the Semantic document, the Verizon document, HP, Solutionary, Palo Alto, a bunch of those. That's just me and volunteers working with the authors of their reports to make sure their specialty is characterizing the problem. Our specialty is the translation, right? That problem, can I translate from summaries of bad things into a relatively small number of positive, constructive things to do? Pardon me. The other three, I'll just point out, a lot of these are references or recommendations or folks that use our work now. The rest of these are really not cyber geek institutions, right? The National Governors Association, Association of Policing, Zurich Insurance, other things. CP&I is a security one from the UK. But most of these, again, we're seeing the emergence of these social institutions trying to figure out what to do. And of course, they don't have security staffs, right? They're, the Red Cross, people like that. This is not where they live. So the good news is they look around for something to latch onto, right? And whether it's us or NIST or whatever, that's all fine. But this is more evidence of the emergence of these social forces in motion that are trying to make sense of this problem and do something about it. So, I'm part of the multi-state ISAC. Our center is actually about 100 people. My part of it is actually very tiny. There's a tiny team that runs the Critical Controls Project. There's a bigger team that runs what's called the CIS security benchmarks, which are the detailed configuration guides for like a Windows desktop, an Apache server, an Exchange server, that kind of stuff. And so we have a wider range of things. But I'm going to leave you with the contact information, or you can get an address from me directly or reach me through SPAF. So let me just summarize real quick, and then after the recording's over, I'll be glad to stick around for some time and take questions if you have any. This has been really the story of my career, which has really been riding the wave that we now call cyber, right? So seeing it kind of initially as a technology project, seeing it at the national security level, watching its emergence into all these other different fields, the different sort of the ways that we view the security problem, and then to see it become a basic factor in our economic and social health as citizens of the country. So this is really an amazing journey from my perspective, and I feel really richly blessed to have have the opportunity to be in the room for lots of the big decisions, the big incidents that happened, the big changes that occurred, and a chance to share it back with folks like you. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and so thank you very much for your time and patience here late this afternoon. Thank you.